Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. And since the subjects of our discussion today are three countries in particular, Algeria, Egypt, and Indonesia, I want, as I always do, to extend a very special Carnegie welcome to any viewers who might be tuning in from either North Africa or Southeast Asia. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at Carnegie. And this is the latest in a series of multi-regional comparative events that we've convened with some of the authors of publications in a Carnegie series that we call China Local Global. You know, we often hear that the export of some putative China model is the basis for China's expansion of its global influence. And personally, I have no doubt that in some places and in some cases, Chinese players are indeed promoting models and ideas that are based firmly on their own experiences. But all over the world, from Ecuador in Latin America to Myanmar in Southeast Asia, to Pakistan in South Asia, to Algeria in North Africa, China is expanding its influence, not by imposing its own ways, but in many cases by adapting to deeply embedded local ways. And in the process, what we find is that local actors can have both agency and bargaining power. They can make demands on China, just as they do on their other external partners, including, by the way, the United States. They can promote their own objectives and agendas. And while it's true that Chinese players quite obviously try to get a return on their investment in these countries, local players can and do try to get a return on their investments and goals in the bargain. So that leads us actually to the same place, which is a more active, influential, and globally engaged China. But it's a China that gets from here to there in a very different way than what is sometimes described in a rather conventional way. And that's important because when China assimilates local forms, local norms, and local practices or works through local actors, the results actually tend to better reflect local character, local preferences, and I said the goals of local people and local institutions. So what that means is that a more complete picture of China's influence and impact globally requires a more textured analysis locally, China, local, global. So that's what our two panelists today explored in two very important, in my view, Carnegie published papers. We lost one of our panelists, if you saw the earlier advertisement of this, Gatra Priyandita, to an overnight illness. But happily, we have one of his co-authors, Ben Herskovich, from the Australian National University's School of Regulation and Global Governance. And we have the author of actually one of my favorite papers in this project, Tinhinan El-Kadi from Chatham House and the London School of Economics in the UK. And their two papers are part of a multi-year initiative, as I said, that we call China Local Global. It's very generously supported by the Ford Foundation, and it explores these adaptive dynamics in Chinese engagement in 7 regions of the world. These two papers are on technology business and on questions around both technology transfer and especially skills transfer, because in all 3 of these case countries, Indonesia, Egypt, Algeria, Chinese players, like, for example, the telecom national champion Huawei, responded to local demands by localizing their business strategies and operations. And that actually led to some surprising outcomes. For example, in Ben's paper on Indonesia, there's clear strategic national security and political tension between Indonesia and China. But surprisingly, maybe, Chinese firms became the country's cybersecurity partner of choice, even though cyber is widely considered to be a security-related technology. So ultimately, both of these papers show that localization happened, but it delivered pretty mixed returns to local people and local economies. And so we want to talk about why and how. So guys, welcome. Thrilled you could do it. Love your papers. And I want to remind everybody you can download the papers from carnegieendowment.org, our website. I thought maybe we could start, and we'll just have a very casual conversation, by asking each of you to maybe reflect a little bit on the papers and give us in sequence several top line conclusions just to familiarize the audience with where you're coming from. What's the story you tell about how the Chinese in your study adapted locally rather than just imposing externally? But above all, I'm hoping you can start by just giving us a sense of the local context in Algeria and Egypt, and then in Indonesia, in which Chinese players were operating. What were the tech objectives? And Tin, I was thinking maybe we start off with you and then we'll go to Ben.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Even, for this great introduction. Well, something I really like about this project is that it very much brings in local agency into the conversation. And often what we read in headlines is that, China is this big giant going to poorer developing nations in Africa and elsewhere, imposing its agenda. And it very much marginalizes local, agency and how local players act on the ground and actually shape the outcome of China's presence. So I've been doing a lot of fieldwork on China's digital presence in North Africa as part of my PhD research, actually. I've done about 100 semi-structured interviews in Algeria and Egypt over the past year. And an important thing that comes up is that really everything is bargained. It's continued negotiations between local actors and the Chinese counterparts. So if I had to sum up a bit like the main takeaways, as you asked, Even, well, the first point really, and this is quite a broad point, I would say, is that the digital space is definitely a significant new area of partnership between the Chinese and the North Africans. So often, again, in headlines, we think as China in Africa as being mainly present in the extractive sector, in oil, in mining, in hydrocarbons, and so on. But actually, the digital space is increasingly significant, starting from the BRI, but even before. And this kind of increased with the launch of the Digital Silk Road in 2015. So we've seen a lot of data centers being built by the Chinese in North Africa, smart cities. There's the big Tanger Tech project in Morocco. We've seen a lot of 4G and 5G network infrastructure being built by firms like Huawei and ZTE. And this is very much an emerging trend. Well, this comes at a time where local North African governments are actually seeking to accelerate their transition towards the knowledge economy, the digital economy. So the second takeaway, I would say, is that the digital Silk Road very much aligns with local ICT agendas. So as many of the audience may know, North African economies tend to concentrate in low added value activities. They suffer from sluggish growth and high chronic unemployment rates. Significantly, I think the MENA region as a whole, has the highest rate of university graduates who are unemployed out of any developing region. So there is a need to create jobs in the high added value segment, like, this is called structural transformation, moving from like low productivity jobs to high technology, high productivity jobs. And so in this sense, the Digital Silk Road is viewed as an opportunity to build new infrastructure, to catch up and upgrade on digital infrastructure, and also upscale local labor. So both Algeria and Egypt have been pressing the Chinese counterparts for more technology transfer, and also for the localization of activities that have increased added value, like in research and development, in manufacturing, and so on. And the Chinese have been responding to this call by local governments to localize activities that are more technology intensive. So I guess the third main takeaway would be that Chinese technology firms, and Huawei in particular, have been adjusting local ICT agendas and have been portraying themselves as actually key partners in digital transitions in the region. And so, for instance, when Egypt announced its big ICT Vision 2030 plan, which aims to bring Egypt into a knowledge economy, into a dynamic knowledge economy by 2030, Huawei took about a year or even less to launch its one of its rare open labs across the world in Egypt. That was just the second in Africa after one in South Africa. And it, committed to do research and development in Egypt and localize this prestigious activity in the North African country. So there's been loads of efforts by the Chinese, unlike any other Western competitor, really, to adjust local development agendas. The Chinese have signed partnerships with hundreds of universities across the region to train students into like new technologies. There's been a lot of certifications given by Huawei to local students in the region. There's been also the localization of manufacturing activities in Algeria. We'll talk about that a bit later. So the main point is that beyond its price competitiveness, Huawei tends to be cheaper than its Western competitors by about 30% on some segments of the sector. It's the capacity of Huawei to adjust local development demand that is, one of the key factors behind its success in North Africa, but also globally. And I think this was summed up really well by an Egyptian engineer working for a big French tech firm, one of the competitors of Huawei in Egypt, who told me in Arabic, and I'm translating here, listen, if you want to understand what the Chinese are doing, just look at what the Egyptian government is doing, because the Chinese would always adjust. And I thought that this really summed up well what kind of like how the Chinese tech firms, Huawei in particular, are adjusting Egypt and the North African context more broadly.
Okay, Tim, before I go to Ben, can I just ask you to set the scene in those two countries a little bit more broadly in two ways? Mm-hmm. First, Egypt's obviously a much larger country than Algeria, and it's a larger economy than Algeria, and it's more of a hub country, I think, for the region in terms of business operations. How much variance is there between digital and technology backbone related objectives in Egypt and Algeria? So draw some distinctions. And then second, how wide ranging is the scope of either or both of their digital ambitions? For example, I was reading something about Saudi Arabia the other day, and what's interesting about the kingdom is if you look at some of the vision projects that the government has articulated, they're working with Chinese companies on a lot of them, but they're not just in things like 4G, 5G telecom that you hear about in other regions. It's things like the cloud, where I think Alibaba is the partner. There's stuff on natural language processing in Arabic, AI, big data, use of AI related applications for big data. So the kingdom has very broad ranging digital ambitions that they're turning to China on. And I'm wondering whether that's replicated in North Africa as well, in either of these countries. So just set that scene a little bit, because it describes the environment in which the Chinese firms are operating.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, it's important. Egypt and Algeria are not the same, and definitely not when it comes to their digital transformation. So Egypt is further ahead with that. Egypt has been kind of an IT hub in the region for years. It's some sort of like less successful India in terms of exporting digital services across the world, but it's definitely like how it sees itself. Like, like when I was interviewing people, India was often a country of comparison, I think, in terms of like digital services. So Egypt is a market of more than 100 million people. Algeria is like a smaller market of 40 million people. Also, the Egyptian economy, because it relies less on hydrocarbons, has been trying to diversify in a more serious way, I would say. There's been big efforts, especially over the last 10 years, I would say, to make Egypt a regional digital hub. And for this, the Chinese are kind of seen as like the key partner. So as you mentioned, for Saudi Arabia, there was recently in 2019 a high-level partnership signed between the Egyptians and the Chinese for the development of artificial intelligence and cloud computing capabilities in Egypt. So the Chinese are backing the Egyptian government in developing this. And here there is obviously the story of the nature of the regimes in two countries. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Egyptian president, is obviously attracted to the Chinese model and the Chinese internet model in particular, with Egypt being an authoritarian country with a censored internet, the Chinese model is definitely an appealing one. In Algeria, there has been efforts since 2020. There was like this creation of the Ministry of the Knowledge Economy and Startups, but the country kind of started like its transition a bit later. There's currently talks for kind of moving from 4G to 5G. The Chinese played a significant role in the country's backbone infrastructure. They've kind of built about 70 or 80% of the country's backbone infrastructure when it comes to 4G. And it's likely that they will continue to play a significant role in this transition, but definitely the ecosystem, the digital ecosystem in Algeria is less developed than the Egyptian one.
Great, thanks. All right, so Ben, let's flip to Indonesia. Different country, different region, G20 economy, big economy, big ambitions, but also big ambitions for a digital build out, but with a lot of political tension with China, actually. And so how did we go from, a minister blowing up Chinese fishing boats to China basically building the cybersecurity infrastructure of the country and big parts of the digital backbone? Describe that, and how much did Chinese adaptation and localization to conditions in that country matter?
Thanks so much for that introduction, Evan. And you're absolutely right that prima facie, it is a very odd combination of things, considering the extent of the suspicion in Indonesian society more broadly and among the political elites in Indonesia of China's strategic objectives, and some of those really pointy disputes between Indonesia and China over the southern reaches of the South China Sea or the North Natuna Sea, depending on which capital you're sitting in. And then seeing that in combination with the deep integration between Chinese ICT companies and the Indonesian economy seems really odd. And I think that was really the starting point for our paper, trying to unpick a little bit that paradox. Before getting into the details, though, just let me say thank you to you and to Carnegie for bringing the paper to fruition and bringing this event to fruition. It's really wonderful to be a part of this. And I think from a kind of big, broad macro point of view, I'd want to echo one of the points that Tin made at the outset about the importance of the agency of developing countries in all of this. And that's something that when you're having a debate about Huawei and its engagement in the rest of the world, often in Australia, and I imagine it's similar in the United States, it is assumed that this is a big nefarious plan from an all-powerful company backed by an all-powerful government that is railroading its way into various different developing countries and pushing its standards, pushing its values onto them. And what we saw when we started to dig into the Indonesian experience was a very, very, very different story. And I think the story really starts with Jakarta's priorities in all of this. As you point out, a very significant country, demographically speaking, economically speaking, and one with huge ambitions. President Jokowi has ambitions to build his country's economy into one of the top 10 economies globally in the next 15 years or so. And there are big plans to have the digital economy at the center of that development drive. And I think that overarching focus on development and economic growth and the creation of jobs for millions of Indonesians really is where the story starts. And when you start looking at the statistics in Indonesia, you start to see the scale of the challenge for the Indonesian government in trying to position Indonesia as a dynamic, digitally focused economy. And again, there are echoes here between the experience of North African countries and Indonesia in terms of there being a strong policy push at the highest level in government to have digital economic growth at the center of the development project more broadly. And there are statistics suggesting that Indonesia will face a really significant shortfall when it comes to the ICT skills necessary to follow that development path. And there was a World Bank report from 2018 that was talking about an additional 9 million ICT workers required by 2030, which is a really big uphill battle. So Indonesia is looking for the skills and training to build up the capacity to achieve its developmental goals. And then on top of that, it is seeking the infrastructure, the kind of digital backbone for building a digitally focused economy. And it's an archipelagic nation, it's big and complex and with incomplete ICT coverage. And so what that means is that companies like Huawei and other Chinese tech companies are coming in and being able to front up with the two key things that Indonesia needs to achieve its broader developmental objectives: the cheap infrastructure, which we've referenced a couple of times, and also really significant skills and training offerings. And I think those are the two things that we found again and again as we were conducting our research, that China and Chinese ICT companies are presenting themselves as reliable partners in those two key objectives for Indonesia of building infrastructure in an ITC sense, and also developing its skills offerings and sourcing the training needed to build a digital workforce for the future. And then the third big aspect for us in our work was a different risk assessment in Indonesia in relation to Chinese tech companies. So if you're having conversations in Washington or Canberra about Chinese ICT companies and the possible security risks associated with them, the conversation really does focus on that overarching security risk consideration. Whereas in the case of Indonesia, there is an appreciation that there are security risks associated with depending on and engaging with Chinese ICT companies, but those security risks are seen as much less significant in terms of making a final decision from the point of view of policymakers than all the additional infrastructure and skills and training benefits that would be gained from engaging with those Chinese tech companies.
Absolutely. I just want to jump in here.
Yeah, please.
If I may. It was the same during my interviews in Algeria and Egypt. So every time I would ask questions to policymakers about the risk associated with having Chinese firms building the backbone infrastructure, this would always appear as like not a priority. It was said by actually a high-level official in the Algerian government who said that the priority was really catching up on infrastructure. And if the Chinese are the cheapest and also are the ones who come with funding from either the China Development Bank or the Exim Bank and so on. So of course they would go and purchase equipments from Chinese manufacturers. And it was funny because one said that in the telecom sector, in the digital sector more broadly, someone is always going to spy on you. And for a developing nation like Algeria, the choice would be either being spied on by the Americans or the Europeans or the Chinese. But it was at the end of the day, we do need this infrastructure. So,
sorry, could I just quickly jump in there, Evan, because that is so interesting to hear from you, Tin, because we were conducting our research by primarily engaging with a whole host of experts and academics in Indonesian universities and think tanks, and then also a wide range of Indonesian officials. And they said precisely the same thing to us over and over again, that yes, of course, we understand the security risks associated with using Chinese infrastructure and depending upon Huawei or ZTE. But the reality is that we know through hard-learned lessons that if it's not the Chinese spying on us, it'll be the Americans or it'll be the Australians. And these conversations were often pretty amusing in their tone because it was them talking to a group of Australians and they said, look, the reality is we know that you're conducting mass surveillance upon us and that is a big security vulnerability for us. And yes, there might be similar problems associated with China, but we'll still be facing the same problem with you regardless of what we do. And one quote that really stuck with me, it was a point made by a senior Indonesian official at one point. He said something to the effect of, look, the reality is that if we're constantly afraid, our development is just going to stagnate. And they know the risks, they understand the risk, they're fully alive to that, but it just gets much less emphasis in their decision making than all of the opportunities associated with being able to purchase relatively cheap infrastructure and receiving a whole host of additional skills and training offerings from Chinese companies and the Chinese government.
So we say this initiative is about what's distinctively local, but it turns out that a high degree of cynicism is distinctively global because it seems to be infecting both of your cases. Can I know you talk to local officials and local people, but I know you talk to Chinese folks too that were doing business. So I'm just curious, if you flip to the Chinese side of this, I'd be curious if you could both talk a little bit about how Chinese players, but especially Chinese commercial players, know what they know. In other words, how do they learn how to localize and what it means to localize? This is not peculiar to China, right? You talk to the CEO of any successful multinational company, that does business on in 6 regions of the world. And they'll say, oh, the key to success is to have a globally competitive product, a high quality product, a high quality service, but something that is embedded locally. I mean, American firms, European firms, Australian firms, they do that too. So if local knowledge is the key to business success, it does raise the question of how Chinese players who are newer to the global game than a lot of Western multinationals learn. How do the Chinese players that are active in the digital space in Algeria or in Egypt or in Indonesia, how do they acquire local knowledge? Is it through local employees? Is it through market research? Is it through risk analysis arms? Is it just through trial and error and bad experiences that they then learn from and they improve their practices? What's the key to local knowledge for a Chinese player? And by the way, is it any different than what a global multinational displays?
Okay, if I could jump in. It's a great question. I think from what I've seen, definitely in Algeria and Egypt, is very much an instance of like learning by doing. So there was a lot of trial and error. And actually the way Chinese firms, whether it's Huawei, ZTE, these big Chinese equipment manufacturers have localized in the region has changed over time. So Huawei and ZTE also came to Algeria and Egypt at the turn of the century, so the early 2000s. And their practice, their presence has very much evolved. In terms, for instance, I had access to some data on the number of local employees. This, the localization of employees has increased significantly through time. So before, Huawei was basically like all the top management, and many of the workers, including in administrative positions and like positions that could very easily be localized, were all Chinese. But with time, and mainly with pressure from local governments to hire more locally and like train more local engineers and help them join these firms, you have an increasing share of employees being hired that are local. So when I was in Egypt last June, actually, I was told that like at the moment Huawei, 70% of the staff is Egyptian in Huawei Egypt, and it's about the same thing in Algeria. And so this was very much learning by doing, and it's used strategically in the discourse and like the public relations of Huawei, saying, Huawei Algeria is an Algerian firm, and we hire locally. We've started also sourcing locally, but then there is a big difference between the official discourse, that is obviously a commercial discourse aimed to get more contracts and be viewed favorably by governments across the region, and then what's happening in practice. So I think a very important situation and that exemplifies this kind of like learning by doing, but also trying to like help the local economy, but not really like while still trying to keep intellectual property and so on, is in the case of the factory that Huawei opened in Algiers. So Huawei opened its very first factory on the African continent in Algeria. And that was after the Algerian government banned the import of cell phones. So after 2014, there was this drop in oil prices. The country's finances were suffering. And so the Algerian government decided to really adopt an import substitution policy. And it forced all major phone manufacturers to start manufacturing their phones locally, or just stop selling their phones in the local market. And Samsung was the first big manufacturer that opened a factory in the country. And then Huawei was kind of scared to lose its market share. And so they opened a factory in Wadi Samar in Algiers and started producing around 30,000 phones per month. However, like even though in the discourse it's like a manufacturing activity, obviously these are theoretically assumed to generate a lot of technology spillovers, a lot of knowledge transfer, and so on. In reality, the Chinese were importing everything from China. I interviewed a line manager who told me that even the boxes, like the phone boxes, were imported from China. even like the tape used to close the phone boxes was imported from China. And so there was an attempt to adjust, the local demand of the government to localize manufacturing. But then in practice, there was very little integration with the local economy. There was very little local supply. The Chinese were not really working with local Algerian firms that could have provided these boxes or like batteries and so on, which is the process that we tend to expect when there is a localization of manufacturing activities. And so, ultimately the factory had to shut down because the Algerian government described the practice as fictitious production and disguised imports. And so the factory had to shut down because basically all the main components, Huawei was not longer able to import the main components to produce phones. And at the moment, so last time I was in Algeria, the factory was not operating. And there's still like these negotiations to reopen and so on. But I would say that it is a case of like trial and error. Maybe Huawei thought that they could get away with that kind of fictitious form of production. But at the moment, the factory stopped working. I guess from what I read from Ben's paper, the situation is rather similar when it comes to technology transfer, I guess.
But before I go to Ben, can I just push you on that a little bit? Why didn't they learn around there? I mean, how do you explain the failure given the Algerian government's priorities? Because we see that everywhere. I mean, what countries basically want is more of the value added left inside their countries and in their economies. And they want employment locally, and they want upskilling. And then ultimately they want technology transfer. But if they're not going to get technology transfer, they clearly at least want knowledge and skills transfer. But when you're talking about packaging solutions, that's at the low end of the tech package that Huawei is offering. So it's counterintuitive that seems like it ought to be the most transferable part of the Huawei supply stack, as opposed to the high end. So even if the Chinese were resistant at the high end, it's hard to understand why they were so resistant at the low end. And that gets, I guess, to kind of the title. Actually, the title of your paper is How Huawei's Localization in North Africa Delivered Mixed Returns. So there's the mixed returns. But it just seems so counterintuitive from the standpoint of business strategy and corporate relations locally. How do you explain it?
Absolutely. Well, talking to a Chinese representative working for Huawei, the argument, because I asked the same question, I was like, surely you could have integrated this part of the production process. We're not talking about chips, we're not talking about high-tech products, but like, the boxes, the batteries, the chargers, the Algerian ecosystem does actually produce these things. And he told me, and I thought, I don't know, I thought there was a bit of bad faith there, that like they weren't able to get in touch with any firm or startup that, could meet the Huawei standards for these segments of production, whether it's the boxes or the chargers, the batteries, and so on. And so I think there's definitely, and this is a problem that comes down to industrial policy, there is a problem of mismatch when it comes to connecting some of these big players with the local industrial ecosystem. And there are efforts to do, some countries, like Egypt has a good database, systematic database of local firms that could collaborate with Chinese partners in either in manufacturing or in service provision. And it's very detailed, but on the Algerian side, this has not been done. But beyond that, the main reason is that I think, Huawei at the end of the day is not a political entity, it's not a charity, it's a commercial firm. And they would do whatever it takes to maximize profits. Obviously, there is an attempt to please local governments and try to adjust local development agendas. But there's a lot of secrecy around their own intellectual property, around production. So even training was done in a way to ensure that, the most cutting edge technologies were not diffused. And so there's a lot. It's like this kind of bargain by trying to localize some high added value activities, but at the same time trying to keep their technological advantage.
And the Algerian government presumably did not have the bargaining power to basically hold Huawei's feet to the fire.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it did not just happen with Huawei, it actually also happened in the Samsung factory and a whole range of other manufacturing activities, even in the automobile sector, where there was a lot of manufacturers that just stopped production because they could not meet the high integration rate demanded by the Algerian government, because there was clearly a mismatch between the Algerian government's bargaining ability and the integration rate they were asking for.
And do Algeria and Egypt have kind of a make in Algeria, make in Egypt policy analogous to India's make in India policy?
Absolutely.
Because that has specific requirements and percentages, and it's the same.
Yeah, no, it's high. Like both countries, have a big unemployment problem. Historically, the manufacturing sector has been great in absorbing extra labor. And so both countries have at the moment this big kind of like import substitution policies in place with high integration rates required. Some are more gradual than others. I think the Algerian government now is learning to have more gradual policies when it comes to asking for integration rates, especially in the high-tech sector. But yeah, both countries at the moment are really trying to create quality jobs and also upskill the labor.
So, okay. So Ben, flip to Indonesia. So how do Chinese firms learn in Indonesia? I mean, obviously there are a lot more Chinese firms operating in Indonesia. There are Chinese firms all across the Indonesian kind of manufacturing and economic ecosystem. But I'd be curious both how they learn, and since Japan, I think, is still a much larger investor, certainly across Southeast Asia than China, but including in Indonesia, whether you see variance in terms of how Chinese firms learn locally there versus how multinationals have learned locally there. Is there something distinctively Chinese?
That's a fascinating question. I think the general impression that we had some engagements with some of the Chinese firms operating in Indonesia, and they weren't necessarily that forthcoming in terms of the granular detail of how they've executed their strategy in the country over the last 5 to 10 years. But the snippets that we did get suggested that there was an attempt to present their role as being partners in Indonesia's overall development. And of course, that is on some level PR gloss. And as Tin points out, these are commercial operators looking after their own interests, seeking to drum up business. But I think it does speak to them knowing that they will achieve the maximum kind of social license to operate in Indonesia and minimize domestic resistance to their role and minimize concerns about the security threats associated with being dependent upon a Chinese tech company, if they're able to make a really compelling case to Indonesian political elites, the Indonesian media, and I guess the public more broadly, that they are there not just as companies seeking to gain market access and sell products and sell services, but also as organizations which are going to be providing a lot of infrastructure at a good price, which will be very competitive in comparison to other international rivals, but also companies that are going to be there providing significant amounts of skills and training. And I think that's probably the centerpiece from Jakarta's point of view, and maybe the broader Indonesian public's point of view, the skills and training package. Part of the goal for the Indonesian government is really supercharging the e-commerce sector, having that grow at a really dramatic rate, having much more innovation in that space. And there are some big champion tech companies in Indonesia that are relying on that kind of platform economy. And that's a big part of Indonesia's development objectives. And that requires a huge amount of additional skilled ICT workers, programmers, and the like. And Huawei is coming in and making very significant pledges about the number of people that they will be training. And when we started to dig into how that training was being offered and delivered, it became really clear that it was really, really appealing because much of it is really vocationally focused. So it's short courses aimed at providing people with very particular skills that they can acquire in a short period of time and then go and apply in a professional context, in the context of developing an app, for example, for a new delivery service in Indonesia or whatever the case may be. And also they are complementary in many cases, and they're providing it in a way which is kind of iterative and organic. And maybe here there is a bit of an echo of what Tin is saying, in that we had one experience where we were talking to an academic at an Indonesian university, and he's kind of a leading academic, but also a bit of an ICT expert and tech entrepreneur himself. And he'd been approached by Huawei to provide free short courses to his cohort of students. And as part of that approach, there was also this offer of, can you please introduce us to your contacts and colleagues at other Indonesian universities and Indonesian technical colleges, because we want to roll that out on a much broader scale. That was the implication. And I think that kind of approach, when you have employees from Huawei, for example, approaching people in that way, offering something really tangible and concrete that's obviously beneficial, and then seeking to have it kind of snowball into something bigger through this natural process of offering something appealing and then word of mouth and spreading it in an organic fashion. That is a really compelling approach. And I think going back to my first point about the kind of PR gloss of being a partner for Indonesia's development, once you're in the business of doing that, it starts to seem less like PR gloss and more like a broadly accurate account of the kinds of developmental and human capital benefits that Indonesia can gain from partnering with Huawei.
Can both of you talk a little bit about the politics of China and doing business with China and welcoming Chinese investment in all three of these countries? There are places all around the world where China and Chinese activity is becoming a political football locally. And that's true even in places where China's localizing. And partly some of that is domestic politics, right? When China localizes, so it's working with, and Chinese players are by extension empowering a certain set of local elites and actors who are invested both literally and metaphorically in doing business with China. And so for people who are not, quote unquote, invested in China, that becomes a source of domestic political contention. But on the flip side, also, there's a lot of public pressure that sometimes we find politicians are responding to. So in Central Asia, for example, we published a paper on Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. There's lots of protest activity among locals in Kyrgyzstan, for instance, around areas where Chinese mining companies are active, around everything, around the scope and scale of local employment, around environmental practices, land practices, and so on. I'm just curious, the Chinese learning, such as it is, as was showed in a paper we did in this series on the Philippines, is often to just co-opt or enlist one set of local actors who then basically do the work domestically. So they function as a proxy, but they're also functioning in their own domestic political interest. Because collaborating with China is partly in their domestic political interest. So I'd just be curious how much politics is in this as China's profile, presence, and posture, particularly in the tech sector, has ramped up. Are you seeing China become a contentious source of political debate, or not so much? Either one of you.
Yeah, I can start. That's fine. Yeah. So for governments, I think for both the Egyptian and Algerian governments, the partnership, the globalization of China has been a great opportunity. Really, it has allowed in a way to diversify economic partnerships, but also it has kind of like legitimized some authoritarian practices and kind of like gave also a financing alternative for a lot of the developmental projects. So if you go and, within both the Egyptian and Algerian context, the idea of achieving growth, high, sustainable growth, creating jobs without having to go through a democratic transition is an extremely appealing idea. So the Chinese model is very much looked up to, and you have a lot of leaders trying to mimic the Chinese experience.
The Chinese experience, being authoritarian developmentalism.
Absolutely.
That's what's appealing. It's not the Chineseness of it.
No.
Right. Okay.
Absolutely. So like when you drive across Egypt now, it's all mega infrastructural projects, Chinese style. There is a new capital being built. You have bridges, ports being built, lots of mass infrastructure with the plan to kind of like redraw the map of the country and hopefully steer growth. But there is at the same time lots of obviously repression when it comes to social contestation. So at the elite level, China is seen as a great partner. When it comes to citizens, there was this recent Arab Barometer survey on Arab citizens' perception of China and China's economic presence in the region. And it was funny because, like, in the country where China is least present, citizens had the most favorable vision of China. So in Algeria and Egypt, which are two countries that have still a significant level of Chinese investment compared to other countries in the region, people were more skeptical towards China's presence and more critical. Then in the tech sector, talking to people about, the fact that China is now building the lion's share of the backbone infrastructure, people didn't care that much. There is still the image of the Edward Snowden scandal in people's mind. This was actually cited by some of the people I interviewed. I mean, we talk about spying, but so far the largest scale spying scandal globally that has happened was, driven by the US, and US tech firms were actually spying on behalf of the American state. It's more problematic than that. And I think people in developing countries are aware of this and don't want to be trapped in this dichotomy between the US internet model and the Chinese internet model, and very much want to see what works best for them at the end of the day.
Yeah, so Ben, talk about the politics, which was my initial question. But then what Tin just said gets into the geopolitics a little bit, and not just the politics as well. In October 2020, Mike Pompeo, the American Secretary of State, shows up in Jakarta on a world tour in which, I'm going to exaggerate this a little bit for effect, but he probably spent 85% of his time talking about China and about 15% of his time talking about the American competitive offering. So in Jakarta, not surprisingly, he talked about Xinjiang, he talked about the South China Sea, but then he stood next to the foreign minister, Marsudi, and basically said, well, what are you doing business with China for? So I'd be curious about the politics of it. And then to Tin's point, how much there's a gap between elites and publics. But then also what happens when a country like Indonesia comes under pressure from other external partners who, in the American case, by the way, even though Indonesia is obviously not a treaty ally of the United States, the way, say, Thailand is or the Philippines is, much less Japan or Australia or Korea, it's an essential security balancer more broadly in terms of shaping the environment for Indonesian development and prosperity. So how does Indonesia balance that in terms of the politics and the geopolitics?
Yeah, the politics and geopolitics are absolutely key. And I guess in this period of really fraught and intense geopolitics, the political and the geopolitical often intermingle. It's hard to find publics that are not exposed to the intensity of broader international geopolitical debates. I think one thing to say up front is, again, to echo some of the cynicism that Tin observed in her case studies, that when we were engaging with Indonesian officials and we were talking about how they think about the security risks associated with dependence upon Huawei, for example, it was very quickly retorted that, have you not heard of PRISM and NSA and the Snowden leaks, et cetera, et cetera. So there is that sense of it. There's kind of a tendency towards having a relatively blasé view of security risks associated with China by virtue of the fact that they have a heightened sense of the security risks associated with the United States or Australia. I think one other important point to make on this is the tendency of, I think, both Indonesian elites and perhaps the public more broadly to be able to effectively compartmentalize different elements of security. So at the outset, we were talking about the very significant maritime dispute between Indonesia and China in the southern reaches of the South China Sea. That's obviously incredibly fraught in military, strategic, diplomatic terms. But from the point of view of Indonesian political leaders and the public at large, there is a sense that that is one really fraught area of dispute with China, but that does not preclude really productive and maybe even, if you're thinking about Indonesia's development objectives, essential cooperation with China in a whole host of other arenas, including in the skills and training arena, including in the telecommunications infrastructure arena. So I think the Indonesian policymakers that we spoke to were very comfortable with the idea of being concerned and even fearful of China in one arena, but then embracing China in another. And I think another element of this that's worth touching on is there being a big distinction that came up again and again in our conversations between the risks and dangers and damages associated with cybercrime from non-state actors versus the national strategic security risks of cyber espionage or cyber attacks from state-based actors or state-backed actors. And this is a point which was really labored by a number of the officials that we spoke to. And the basic message from them that we got was that if you're thinking of this issue from the point of view of an Indonesian policymaker, you're going to be highly concerned about cybercrime and the vulnerability of Indonesians to having their personal data compromised and the costs for the economy of cybercrime. And though there is a nexus between cyber criminal activities and state-based cyber attacks or cyber espionage, it is a very different thing in many arenas. And so they really want to combat cybercrime and the risks of that. And Huawei and China more broadly are partners in that, and they can provide skills and training and technology to respond to that cybercrime threat. On the other side of the equation, the state-backed cyber attack risk or the risk of espionage, that's a concern, it's a consideration, they're au fait with it. But again, I think it pales into relative insignificance from the point of view of Indonesian policymakers in comparison to the issue of cybercrime more broadly and the economic and developmental costs associated with that. And one little data point just to capture, I think, the way in which the Indonesian political class is thinking about this, the Indonesian equivalent of the US National Security Agency or the Australian Signals Directorate, the kind of SIGINT agencies, has signed an MOU with Huawei to upskill their cybersecurity capacity. So not only is there a willingness to engage with China and Chinese tech companies from the point of view of developmental priorities, they also see Chinese tech companies and the Chinese state more broadly as a partner in terms of responding to cybersecurity threats, which is obviously a radically different approach to this issue than the one you would see in Washington or Canberra or a range of other capitals. And I think that partly explains why the politics and geopolitics of the issue are so fundamentally different in Indonesia.
Sorry, and are they not under pressure from Washington, Canberra, and Tokyo and other partners on that? I mean, I would think, even if I just go, let's go before we get to the cyber thing. I mean, just go to the commercial backbone, right? So the United States, toward the end of the Trump administration, started a campaign essentially against Huawei globally to try to get Huawei kit out of the emerging backbone in a lot of places, not just in OECD economies, but in the global South. And they seem to get more traction on that in, let's say, Western Europe than they did, advanced industrial economies in Europe, than they did even in more developed Middle Eastern economies, let's say the Gulf. I remember Keith Crocker, who was the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, did a roadshow in some of the Gulf countries. I think it was like Bahrain, Kuwait, and did not get a lot of traction. And I'm not clear that they've gotten a lot of traction anywhere in the Middle East. So in a place like Indonesia, where there's a growing set of strategic ties with the United States, even in the security and tech area, is that self-limiting? I mean, it seems like it would be a very stark set of choices for a government like Indonesia's, where if you go in one direction with the Chinese, it really does put hard constraints on what's possible in terms of collaboration with the United States, even in the commercial sector, but certainly because of US export controls and foreign direct product rules and extraterritorialization of US regulatory policy. But especially in the example that you just described, which touches signals and security agencies. That contradiction playing out?
I think the impact of that is relatively limited for Jakarta. And I think one element of it is that if you are looking at this issue from the perspective of an Indonesian leader or policymaker, generally speaking, the sense that we got is that you have a great deal of self-confidence in your status as a monumentally important geopolitical swing state and in your status as a really significant global economy and a significant diplomatic force globally. And I think Jakarta in general sees itself being courted by a whole host of capitals, whether it be Canberra, whether it be Washington, that are trying to win it over to their view of things on China. And they see that as being, on some level, a position of strength in that they are not dependent on the United States or Australia. They don't need to absorb the view from Washington or the view from Canberra, and perhaps they can enjoy additional attention and additional courting and additional offers by virtue of the fact that they are more of a swing state and not so aligned with, let's say, broadly speaking, a liberal democratic bloc. I think the other aspect of the issue is that on a lot of these matters, policymakers from Australia or the United States will go in and they'll talk to their Indonesian counterparts and say, here are security concerns A to Z that you should be worried about when you're engaging with China and when you're purchasing tech from Huawei. And the Indonesian officials will nod politely and listen to the talking points from their Australian and US counterparts. But the response will often be, that's well and good. We understand all the security issues, but what is the alternative? What in practical terms are you offering? Are you offering us the commitment to train 100,000 Indonesians in critical ICT skills? No. Are you offering ICT equipment at a cost that is 30% lower than competitors elsewhere in the world? No. Therefore, we have relatively limited motivation to embrace your view of things and disassociate ourselves from Huawei. And there is a lot of cynicism, I think, in Indonesia in particular, vis-a-vis Australia. That's the case I'm most familiar with. And we had a number of conversations with Australian officials who've been working in this space. And they said that it was kind of frustrating for them in that they go into Indonesia with the standard Australian talking points about security concerns, China doing X, Y, and Z, be really worried. And they just knew that the Indonesians would politely listen, but it would just not cut through because you're not bringing anything to the table that is responding to Indonesia's underlying concerns about development objectives, infrastructure, and skills and training for the future.
Yeah, well, I'm watching the clock. I actually want to come back to that before we close because you have a new government in Australia, and the new prime minister, Mr. Albanese, made his first foreign visit was to Indonesia, if I'm not mistaken. And so, other than riding bicycles around, with President Jokowi, which they did with their bike helmets, I mean, one would think that the Australian message, particularly with the opportunity of a new government, would be calibrated in that context because Indonesia is so important. So I just want to come back at the very end and ask you to be prescriptive. And I know we're coming up on time, but before I do that, I want to ask particularly to Tin a question that came in from the audience. One thing that is implicit in this conversation is whether there's something different and distinctive about what competitors to Chinese players are offering that distinguishes them. And I think the way one of our audience members, this is a question that came in from Giacomo Bruni, who basically said, I presume the Chinese players are not coming in with democratic, or he calls it ethical requirements as compared to US or European multinationals. So Algeria and Egypt are not democracies. So let's broaden this beyond the question of democratic requirements. So let's say corporate social responsibility, right? A lot of Western firms bring in, they're guided by their own approaches to CSR. They're guided by their own approaches to corporate ethics. That affects their localization strategies. I've heard a lot of talk over the last few years about CSR in China. People talk about how they're developing sense of corporate social responsibility. But if that was real, then you would see it, particularly in overseas operations where the context is very different. So to go to Giacomo's very direct question, is corporate social responsibility, commercial ethics, and in the Indonesian case, democratic norms, because these are companies that are headquartered in democracies in the West, for example, or in Japan, which is not in the geographic West, but is an advanced industrial democracy. Is that a competitive advantage for them that distinguishes them from China? Or has China been able to navigate that in part by having Chinese firms sell themselves as offering a brand of corporate social responsibility that, again, back to the adaptation theme, is not just Chinese, but is adapted to local expectations around, somebody mentioned a social license before. And I'd be particularly curious for Tin, because those are contexts that are not political liberal democracies, but where social license presumably matters anyway.
Absolutely. Well, interestingly, the Chinese are doing more CSR in Africa and Egypt than their Western competitors, by far. Like when you visit local universities, you go to local departments, you find Huawei equipment, Huawei training, Huawei organized competitions, and they're doing much more in terms of like, you know, providing cutting edge training to local students, taking students to Huawei's headquarters, for instance, in Shenzhen, than the, let's say, the most direct competitors like Ericsson or Nokia. And this is, I think, my assumption would be that it's because the Chinese are latecomers in the sector, and so in a way they have to do more to you know, catch up and take more market shares. So if we look at the enterprise subsector of Huawei, when it comes to providing students with certifications, Huawei, these ICT certifications are necessary if you're a young engineer wanting to join a big firm, or you know, just wanting to start up your own. It's good to be certified in one of the major OEMs, so original equipment manufacturers, licenses. And historically, this segment was dominated by Cisco. And in recent years, Huawei has been doing like crazy efforts to really catch up with Cisco. And so they even cut the cost of the certification test. It's a test that costs about like $300. And during COVID-19, I learned during my interviews that Huawei made all its tests free. So when given the choice, local, you know, Algerian students and Egyptian students would choose to get certified by Huawei. And then this kind of builds an ecosystem, because then you have more local engineers trained on Huawei technologies. You have more firms than local firms knowing how to install Huawei technologies. And with time, you have like kind of operators opting more to buy Huawei, because it's the ecosystem is trained on Huawei technology. So there's a lot of CSR happening. And yeah, like actually the Chinese are doing more of this than their Western counterparts. Just a little point on the democratic question. There's actually great research done by Ingenio Gagliardon in Africa. He basically goes from this assumption: are Chinese tech firms spreading authoritarian values, unlike their Western competitors? And he takes two African democracies, I think that was Kenya and Ghana, and two African autocracies, it was Ethiopia and Rwanda. And he compares how Huawei and ZTE adjust these local contexts. And what he finds is that, you know, these firms are not imposing their authoritarian views. They don't come with inherent politics embedded in their softwares and hardwares. Actually, they adjust the local context. So in Ghana, where the internet is pretty much free, in Kenya also, where there is a competitive digital ecosystem, the Chinese have adjusted the local system. However, in Rwanda and Ethiopia, where there was demand from the state to have more surveillance and a more controlled internet, Chinese firms have also adjusted this claim, this demand from local governments. So I think it very much depends on the local institutional framework and the local politics.
So context matters, because it's easier to spread authoritarian values in an authoritarian context than it is in a non-authoritarian context. So even if they seek to, which I guess gets at a question, we have a question from someone named Kane Shearer, who basically said, do Chinese firms such as Huawei operate as an apparatus of the state? So Huawei purports to be it's a private firm, but I mean, let's face it, it's a national champion firm. I mean, it's China's telecom's national champion. So the question would be whether de facto, even if not de jure, it basically operates as an arm of the Chinese state overseas. And I mean, either one of you can answer that, but Ben, maybe you can answer that in the Indonesian context.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, that big analytical question of the relationship between Huawei and the Chinese state, much debated, incredibly complex, a lot of claims back and forth. My sense of it is that it operates to a certain degree as an apparatus of the state, in that when you think about things like the National Intelligence Law from 2017 in China and the requirement for Chinese companies to assist with intelligence efforts, it's hard to then not think of Huawei as on some level a function of the Chinese state. And then also the extent of the level of state support for Huawei makes it not dissimilar to an arm of the Chinese state. In that regard, though, I think it is important to point out that we are entering a phase of global politics where companies around the world are increasingly operating as arms of their respective states. Certainly in the case of Australia, the Australian government has just bankrolled Telstra, a big Australian telecommunications company. They've bankrolled its purchase of a Pacific Island telco named Digicel.
Right. Yeah.
And we see that in the United States as well, where there is an increasingly tight relationship between companies more broadly and state strategic objectives. So in a way, maybe China is a front runner on this. I saw a really interesting article recently about testimony to Congress by a range of Wall Street banks, all saying, look, if the US government tells us to disengage from China, we'll do it. We take the lead of the US government. The idea of freewheeling capitalist, large financial firms taking the lead of the US government, it's a bizarre world we're in. So I think in a way, Huawei's there, but so are many other countries increasingly, and so are many other companies. I just wanted to jump in on this issue that Tin was discussing of the way in which there is an increasingly tight alignment between the Chinese tech companies and the Chinese state. And I think that is a factor for policymakers in Indonesia. But again, I would say to some of the points that Tin is making as well, that is kind of counteracted by the benefits that can be acquired, and even the benefits that can be acquired for intelligence agencies and the security sector more broadly in the Indonesian state. And I think one point to make on here in terms of the values aspect of this equation and the broader corporate social responsibility point is that, yes, Indonesia as a broadly speaking liberal democracy, very politically different from China as an authoritarian one-party state, but Indonesia has a different approach to managing the information domain than, say, the United States or Australia, and in many ways wants to benefit from some of the effective tools that Chinese tech companies have for managing the information domain. Indonesia has much more restrictive approaches to things like blasphemy and religious talk, and they also have deep concerns about misinformation and disinformation and want to ensure that the kind of social cohesion dangers associated with that are minimized. And so on some level, I think Indonesian policymakers are much more amenable to engaging with Chinese tech companies because they don't necessarily have the kind of freewheeling, thoroughly liberal democratic approach to information that a US government or an Australian government might have. And then one final point on the corporate social responsibility piece. I think on some level, we maybe need to have a broader concept of that. Part of that might be about values and maybe at a stretch human rights and the like. But part of it is also just long-term thinking and human-centered development and jobs and growth. And in that sense, even though Chinese tech companies don't frame their offering as part of corporate social responsibility in Indonesia, so far as we saw, in practice, they are positioning themselves as relatively responsible corporate actors by virtue of the kinds of skills and training and development offerings they're providing.
Okay, so we've run over time. So first, I apologize for that. And I apologize to the audience too, because we hate to run over time here at the Carnegie Endowment. But this has been an interesting conversation. I do want to ask you one last question. So we're going to run even more over time. Sorry about that. I want you both to get a little bit prescriptive, if you don't mind, just as a last question. And you can keep the answers as tight as you want. But one of my colleagues from Carnegie, Mike Nelson, who's a senior fellow in technology policy at Carnegie, put a question in the chat. And I'm going to broaden his question. He basically said, the US, Japan, and some European nations have aid programs designed to build tech capacity building and promote their companies. So then he says, what lessons could they learn from China's experience? But I want to flip that as well. Not just what lessons could they learn, but also the question of how do they compete, given what you've both said with the Chinese offerings, right? Because if you believe Pompeo, or you believe Tony Blinken or anybody, we're in a strategic competition. That's how a lot of governments around the world are defining what's going on dynamically between them and players in the global south. Now, this initiative is anchored in the idea that local agency actually matters quite a lot and that it can be shown empirically. So if local agency matters a lot, then locals have a lot of bargaining power, and the operations that matter mathematically ought to be addition and multiplication rather than subtraction and division. And so what that means is they're going to push on all of their external partners to meet their expectations, demands, and needs, which include, as you both said, growth, upskilling, employment, sustainability, and so on. So get prescriptive for a second, whether it's for Washington or Paris or Canberra or global companies. What can they learn from what the Chinese are doing in these three countries? And then extrapolate from that to talk about how they can be more competitive. Like what could they either learn or not learn? What are the lessons not to be learned? And then we'll use that as the wrap up. So I'll go in reverse order. Ben, why don't you start?
Thanks for that. Yeah, really important. And I'm always happy to go policy prescriptive myself. As part of the paper that we wrote with my co-authors Gatra Priyandita and Dirk van der Klee, we published a kind of spin-off policy paper specifically for the Australian government and published a few short form pieces trying to unpack what we thought the take-home message was for policymakers and corporate actors. On the corporate side of it, I think perhaps it's a little simpler in that Huawei and other Chinese telcos are offering infrastructure at very cheap prices, and they're also offering free training or very cheap training. And can you front up with those kinds of appealing offers? And if you can't, then you're probably not going to be competing. We were talking to one Indonesian academic, the one that I mentioned earlier, who was engaging with Huawei to provide his students with free short courses. And he made references to some of the offerings from companies like Apple in Indonesia, and it costs a lot of money. And that means that it's not going to be accessible to huge numbers of Indonesians. So I think on some level, it comes down to simple questions of cost and free offerings. In terms of the government side of the piece, one of the big messages that we wanted to offer policymakers in Canberra and Washington in the wake of our paper was that there really is scope here for the US and Australian and other governments to provide perhaps support to their tech companies to be able to offer some of the free additional extras that the Chinese companies are offering and provide Indonesians with alternative training options. And I think that's one of those cases of a win-win all round, in that the level of demand for additional skills in Indonesia is so great that the Chinese companies, despite the significance of their offerings, they're not saturating the market. There's still additional demand out there. And so there's scope for the US government or the Australian government to partner with tech companies and provide additional benefits. And that will be good for Indonesia developmentally speaking. It'll be good in terms of diversifying the tech ecosystem in Indonesia, and it'll be good for the United States and Australia to compete for influence in Indonesia, which in a hard-headed strategic diplomatic sense, Washington and Canberra are certainly doing. And then the other aspect of this, I think, is partnering with vocational colleges. So this is more relevant to Australia, perhaps, and I don't know the US system as well, but in Australia, we have a system of state-based vocational colleges that offer short courses. And one of our suggestions was to have those colleges go into Indonesia, identify provinces and cities where there is a dire need for additional training, and provide it as part of the Australian development program. And we also thought there was scope here potentially for some kind of quad offering, in that the quad is all about providing tangible benefits in the region to counteract China. They never talk about China, but everyone knows it's to counteract China. And if you can roll into a significant developing country like Indonesia with tangible skills and training that are needed for growth, that will be a great offering for the Quad and good for PR purposes in New Delhi, Tokyo, Washington, and Canberra.
Yeah, it's funny, the US doesn't really do vocational in the same way, and China's doing vocational all over the place. We did a paper in this series that focused on something called a Luban workshop. So Luban workshops are a network of vocational training facilities that China's doing around the world. And so they train at the high end, master's and PhD students, for instance, from Arab countries. But they also train at the low end, which is vocational. And it's striking because nobody knows about it. Really, I mean, some people know about it, but a lot of people in the conventional debate don't. So I sometimes give a talk where I say, anybody heard of Confucius Institute? Put up your hand. And every hand goes up, because this is located at universities and education. And then I say, okay, who's heard of a Luban workshop? And no one's ever heard of it. But in fact, that training element is clearly part of the Chinese offering in a lot of parts of the world. All right, Tin, be prescriptive for a sec.
Okay, great. Well, first, maybe to the US and European governments. Well, as a citizen of a developing country, I find it just extremely arrogant, the attitude of trying to impose hegemony on a shoestring. The Europeans and Americans are coming really with no offer, with no funding of infrastructure, with no training, with no meaningful kind of scholarship programs the way the Chinese are doing. And then asking local governments to just stop using Huawei, using mainly moralistic and ethical arguments that are not grounded on empirical evidence. And I think at some point there is a need to change strategy. So that there was, during the Trump administration, this whole clean network project, which basically asked developing countries that are already struggling to catch up in terms of infrastructure to remove infrastructure built by the Chinese and take loans that had very high interest rates and disadvantaged terms, to then like purchase equipment from US tech manufacturers. And this is, you know, and it was told to me during interviews, like a very kind of sometimes insulting stand for developing countries trying to transition into digital economies. The Europeans, for instance, so we're talking about North Africa, if I'm talking about Algeria and Egypt, the EU is the biggest economic partner. For over 20 years, North African countries, including Egypt and Algeria, have had this like free trade agreement with the European Union, but it hasn't resulted in much investment in these countries. Actually, it hasn't resulted in much job creation and technology transfer, frankly. It's based, at the end of the day, on a very narrow understanding of security, and it's all about migration, migration, and migration control. And so I think at some point it would be interesting to start seeing North Africa more as an area where there could be opportunities for investment, for development, and even in sectors like the digital economy, instead of just seeing it as this potential threat. And I think this is the biggest difference between the Chinese and most Western partners. So the West, at least since 9/11, has seen this region as a potential threat, while the Chinese see it as an economic opportunity. You know, when Huawei comes in, like they want to do business, and they come with business deals, and you know they have, it's not always efficient. Obviously, there's concerns about maintaining control over their intellectual property and all of that. But there is an attempt. There's funding that comes with it. There's training, massive scholarship programs, as you mentioned, Evan, and really European and American partners need to upgrade their game, because otherwise like they're falling behind. If I had to give recommendation and prescriptions for local governments, developing governments, Egypt, Algeria, and other countries across Africa, and I think it would apply to other developing countries, I think really it's important to kind of like consider the bargaining capacity of each country, and sometimes think about broader integration to extract more from these big tech giants. So, you know, having a North African consortium of countries negotiating with Huawei and other firms could increase the bargaining powers of these countries and kind of like expand market power and so on. But ultimately, I think if these countries are to really build thriving knowledge economies, it's important to focus on developing indigenous capacities, building local innovation, and really learning from China's own experience of like developing a strong local ecosystem, trying to localize R&D and really promote local innovation.
Which requires, of course, pushing the Chinese harder for
Absolutely.
more as well, not just learning, but pushing.
Absolutely.
Because as you said, when you talked about the supply chain, too much is in fact not being localized still, even when you have a localization strategy. All right, so first, I apologize to the audience for running over time, but even though I'm usually very hard-nosed, this was such a great discussion that I couldn't help myself. I just had to do it. So 4 quick things. First, I want to thank you both. Tin, you're amazing. Ben, you're fabulous. I love both these papers. I really do. I think they're really, because they're really empirical, they're granular, they're interesting, they tell stories, but they also kind of flip the script and put an interesting twist on this digital. It's always framed as digital competition. So it makes the countries the object of competition rather than the subjects of their own stories. And you really anchor the stories around the countries. They're really the center of the stories. And so it sheds a lot of light. So thank you for that. Second, to the audience, read the papers. They're available, as I said, on the Carnegie Endowment website, carnegieendowment.org, or we have a dedicated China local global site. So you can read all the papers as we're rolling them out, but we also have multimedia products, interviews with authors. There's event videos from comparative cross-regional events like this. Third, since, as I said, this is about local ecosystems, we try to reach out to local audiences. So I want to point out that Tin's paper is available not just in English, but in Arabic, and will soon be available in French as well. Ben, the good news is your paper is being translated into Bahasa Indonesia, and it will be out and posted soon. Gatra, your co-author, did a video where he spoke in Indonesian and answered questions about the paper. Tin, you did one in Arabic. So Arabic, French, Indonesian, and we do this with all the papers. They're in Spanish, Burmese, Russian for papers on Central Asia, and so on. Last, this is an ongoing project. We thank the Ford Foundation for their support. And so you're going to start to see a lot of interesting stuff coming out on top of what we have. In the next couple of months, we have papers teed up on Brazil, Niger, Turkey, and places betwixt and between. So we cover a lot of ground in different regions, but ultimately the goal is, as we did today, to be a little bit comparative. So thank you to both of you. Thanks to the audience for tuning in. Go read the papers in whatever language you read them in. And we'll be back with another one of these events fairly soon, but we have some exciting content teed up. Thanks, guys, and thanks, everybody. We appreciate it. Bye-bye.